Well, Justin, man, it is so good to have you here in Fort Myers. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm looking around and I'm quite impressed with the studio. It was probably maybe 6 months ago. You sent me some photos of the work in progress studio, and I didn't want to be a Debbie Downer, so I just was encouraging, just generally speaking, like, work with what you got. But now that I'm here, I'm seeing the transformation and like, wow, well done. This is super cool.
It is super cool, and it's cool that this is our first live recording here
Hey.
with a guest. So we're super excited that you're here for our Digital Missions Lab, not just for our church, but Florida Conference. And we're here all weekend discussing digital missions, and I guess that's a great way to start our conversation
Yeah.
today. You're working digital missions, that's your life now. So what is your working definition currently of what digital missions is?
Yeah, digital missionaries, I think generally speaking, bring at least two ideas to mind for me. One is you're a person trying to navigate a culture that's a bit foreign to you, that's different than the one that you're used to. And second, it generally calls to mind some level of poverty. Okay. That definitely explained my story when I first started digital missions, where what I mean by this is that the church space and the online space, at least in my upbringing, didn't really overlap very well. The general kind of predisposition towards things of technology, and certainly as social media became a thing, when I went to church seminars, when I went to conferences, and anyone remotely referred to social media, it was always in a negative connotation. Social media is evil, it's negative, it's addicting, it's dark, it's all these different things. And, generally speaking, I agree, that's actually true. But the conclusions that these seminars often landed on were, therefore, you should not be on them. I remember attending or listening to a seminar called MySpace Disgrace. And if you remember back to MySpace back in the day, it was maybe my first major social media platform when I was in high school or something along those lines. I remember finishing that seminar and deleting all of my social media at that time because I was just convicted that this was not a place that a person of faith should be on. Many, many years later, I came to realize that while maybe the intentions of that person were noble, that the conclusions were not really in keeping with the mission that Jesus gave us. Jesus talks about how we are the light of the world. And so light is only valuable in so much that it's actually present in the darkness. That's actually its primary function, right? And so this is where this phrase, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness, has kind of been a north compass for me. And so I started to realize that, even though the online space is a space that's very foreign to most people of faith, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be there. And so for me, a digital missionary is someone who's willing to kind of navigate those unknowns, the awkwardness, and have to learn a whole new system of communication and social norms and, just how does it actually look like to engage with people in a space that's foreign and different from you. And then the second thing is just the poverty thing. The reality is most missionaries, when they start, they're not doing it for vanity, for glory. They're not doing it for, to be rich and wealthy and all these different kinds of things. No, you do it out of a sense of purpose and calling. And in the early days, most missionaries, when they head overseas, it requires the support and the prayers and the actual financial backing of other people to at least get things started oftentimes. And when I think about my early journey into the world of social media ministry, this was exactly my case. It was a foreign landscape. It was completely unknown. And it was for many, many, many years. It was a very expensive and costly. It required great sacrifice on both myself, but my family at large, and especially my wife.
Yeah, and I can remember that was not long after you started your digital missionary journey. I think we crossed paths. I mean, I was getting started with my digital mission journey with my podcast, and you were that Christian vlogger at the time.
Yes.
And I know that was your focus, and you were really successful with your YouTube season of life. And then things started to progress for you. So tell me, since the early days of your YouTube experience, and that was where your focus was, and then getting to the point where you are now, which you in my opinion, you have like a broader, kind of more holistic view of your calling than maybe you did back then. So talk about that journey and how your definition of a digital missionary has evolved over the last, 6 years.
Yeah, I think that the idea of a digital missionary is evolving because social media in and of itself is evolving. If you think back to half a dozen years ago, when you were thinking of how do I want to show up in the online space for you, Travis, you probably weighed a couple different things. Should I be a YouTuber? Should I be an Instagrammer? Should I be a blogger? Should I be a podcaster? And there was a very real sense in which every single one of these disciplines are mutually exclusive. The reality was that in order to do any one of these well, you would have to kind of focus on it to the exclusion of other things. And for me, that was YouTube. For you, that was podcasting. And cool, God be praised, we've been able to grow things and minister at these levels. But the challenge is that these platforms were so incompatible with each other that you really only got to choose one. And so rather than having a full-fledged strategy, I really only had a strategy for my YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel had a lot of advantages in discovery and growth, but it also had a lot of kind of missing elements. And so as social media has evolved, what has emerged is that there's new advantages, new ways to leverage the evolving technologies and platforms for a more holistic kind of impact on the kind of people that you're trying to serve. And so for me, over the last year or two, really, it's kind of been a more recent development. I have shifted away from being just exclusionary to one platform and have adopted kind of a be all things. And so it has led me down the road of not only just doing YouTubing, but podcasting as well. It's led me into TikTok and to Instagram. It's led me into podcasting. It's led me into short films, doing a documentary, for example. And it's kind of fun because now I get to play in the sandbox in just general online content creation and communication. And the fun part is that the results tend to be much more meaningful as I begin to think of myself less as a YouTuber per se and really start to think about the big picture when it comes to digital missions. For example, when I first started, in maybe one of my better years as a YouTuber, I would invite people to sign up for Bible studies. And at the time, I didn't really have a mechanism for following up those Bible study interests. And so what I would do is when, in a calendar year, I think my best year, like 2,300 people signed up for Bible studies that I could track at least. And I didn't have a way to facilitate the follow-up because so much of my attention was focused on the very next project, the next one. And a lot of this was because financially, there was not a system in place. And so I had to just keep my head down and keep working hard. So I'd pass all these Bible study interests off to other organizations like Light Bearers, for example. We'd use the TruthLink online Bible studies or something along those lines. Now, what's fun is I can actually get more Bible study interests. I can get anywhere between like 500 to 1,000 people signing up for Bible studies per month. And I actually now have a system where I can actually follow up that entire process and journey with people somewhat at scale in a step-by-step process. And so the evolution of social media has required an evolution in my approach to digital missions. And the net result is greater impact for the kingdom. And I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, and I know I went through your Digital Missions Academy, and I know we're going to be talking about that a little bit later as well. But I've always been, kind of a strategy guy myself, and that was definitely one of the things that really impressed me was seeing how, and it was like light kind of like came on in my own head because, like you were saying, I was very intimidated by just being in front of the camera in general. I'm kind of, I don't know, it just was not my thing.
It's new. Anytime that you do something that's new, it's going to feel awkward. You do a great job, by the way, and being able to watch your journey. I think that you're great on camera. Maybe at the beginning you didn't feel great and you had to learn how to do a better job. And is there a real sense in which you can get better? Sure. But you do a great job now.
Well, thank you. And it is, I think that's part of it is kind of like your own identity or your self-awareness changes, and that's true with just getting used to listening to your own voice, for instance.
Yeah.
And at first at least I'll speak for myself, I just didn't like it. And then after a while, it's like, okay. And then finally you're just like, hey, that's who I am.
Yeah.
And then you don't think about it anymore. I think it's the same thing when you're trying something new. And it is intimidating when you think about all the different kind of competencies that are required to be a competent digital missionary. And but before we get into what some of those competencies are, I think maybe we just start with the big question. We're talking about what digital missions is, and you kind of laid that out a little bit. Reaching into the culture, connecting with people that we wouldn't automatically relate with on a day-to-day basis, and that means going out of our comfort zone, just like a physical missionary would do to reach a different culture. But let's go back to the fundamentals. Like, why digital missions? And I guess we can start maybe from the perspective of a church member, someone who's a committed Christian. They may not be a church leader, or maybe they are, but they're not clergy,
Sure.
or they're not. So just somebody who's maybe a young adult, maybe they're not a young adult, maybe they're older, why should someone consider digital mission?
Yeah, so I think some maybe surprising context to people who haven't heard my story before is that I'm actually not a pastor. People call me pastor at times, just I guess because of the spaces that I interact in, but I'm not a pastor. I actually never went to seminary. I don't work for the church in an official capacity. By all definitions, I am a layperson. I'm just someone who loves the Lord and wants to be able to tell more people about Jesus. At the core of it all, my life has been impacted deeply by the gospel, and it's been a transformative experience. It's something that is, for me, has been the centering thing that my life orbits around, because it's been such a massive impact in my life. And so much of what gets me excited and makes me just really passionate about is just seeing other people begin to find out who they are, what their identity is, to understand how much the Lord loves them. And so whether I was getting paid to or not is kind of it's immaterial. It doesn't matter. My goal is to tell people about Jesus. And so whatever that way looks like, it really doesn't matter to me. The reality is I was not the kind of person who was predisposed to kind of this creative type of ministry. I was not the kind of person who ever took an art class or a graphic designs class or a video editing class or any of those kinds of things. I was a kid that liked math class. I was a kid that if you saw the image on Facebook or on Instagram of left brain, right brain, one of them's really black and white and analytical, and the other one's colorful and expressive. I'm the boring one. I'm just very like let's just do what we need to do. Let's just set our goals. I'm not an expressive person in the creative sense. And so there's many ways in which this is not necessarily the right kind of vocation for me. And the only reason why I do it is because I care about the gospel. I care about the message and sharing it with as many people as is possible. And so as for me, the reason why digital missions matter is just a simple question of, well, what's the way that I can let the most people know about Jesus as possible? If the way for me to do that is to work in a local church context and to help be a part of the weekend gatherings, fantastic, count me in. That's what I want to do. If it looks like me doing door-to-door sales and being a coal porter, which I did for 10 years, knocked on over 100,000 doors in 10 years, cool, sign me up. That's what I want to do. I want to spend time in front of people and inviting them to consider what God says about them and actually believing it and allowing that to take root in their lives and see their lives change. It just so happens to be the case now that right now, social media is the frontier, is the new frontier when it comes to missions. It is the single most impactful thing that anyone who cares about the gospel can spend their time in. There's not a single thing that you could do that will be more leveraged for the kingdom of God than actually investing in online ministry from the very get-go. Why? Because in 10 years, it took me 10 years to do 100,000 door knocked, right? Now, what I can do is quite literally in a 30-minute process after my devotions, just giving from the overflow of what the Lord has taught me that morning, I can reach 100,000 people that moment. So it's incredible to think about how many people can be reached through the online space. And the cool thing about this is oftentimes the algorithms just seem to be that you're going to end up reaching people, yes, in your church, people that are in your friend group, cool. There's a discipleship element to it we can talk about. But also, you're going to be reaching people from all over the world. Now I lead a Bible study every single week, and my Bible study has people from Mexico, from Australia, from Korea, from Madagascar, from Nigeria, from Germany, from literally all over the world. And none of that could have ever happened before. When you think about the way that Jesus talks about greater things will you do than the ones that I do, this is actually a promise, John 14:12. When he says this, it's like, in what meaningful sense can we do that? He walked on water. He raised people from the dead. Perhaps, maybe one of the ways that we can is now this kind of omnipresence that every single one of us has access with the push of a button. I don't know. To me, it's compelling. When I think about how I can spend my life, how I can invest my life, yes, I want to still be local in my local church. I still want to make an impact in, my neighborhood, my community. But when I realize that for a small investment, the same investment that it might take me to drop my kids off at school, for that amount of time, I can actually reach thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe literally millions of people. To me, it just makes sense that if you care about the gospel, if you care about people, and you believe that Jesus wants you to help be a part of fulfilling the Great Commission, it just makes sense that you got to be invested in digital missions in some meaningful sense. Now, maybe in 5 years, that's going to change. Maybe in 5 years, something else is going to come and completely demolish digital missions. I'll be the first one to say, guys, let's go to the new thing. There's a better opportunity. But for now, I'm very, very convinced this is where we need to be spending time if we care about those things.
Yeah, and I'm sure, you've shared this in different platforms and different locations, and I'm sure people have come up to you, whether in person or just reached out to you online, and they say, Justin, man, I really am compelled with your story. I'm convinced that this is what I should do, or somebody should be doing this, maybe. But then there's always those objections, right? There's always those things that, feel like obstacles that are impossible to overcome, and people put those in front of themselves and they think, yeah, I'd like to, but this, and this, and that's why I can't be a digital missionary. So maybe you can share just some of the, 3 or 4, or maybe however many you can think of, some of the objections that you've heard from individuals, specifically non-clergy at this point, and what are some of the things you've said in response?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the layperson, and this was my objection as well, by the way, when I first started, the biggest challenge seems to be finances. I can't afford a fancy studio like this, the multiple cameras, the fancy microphones, the headset, all this kind of stuff. And in one sense, I deeply respect that. Like, I understand the challenge. It was, again, my first challenge when I first started. The good news is that the world has changed. The expectation of, air quotes, quality when it comes to what you create has never been lower than ever before. There's a weird world. There's a tension where quality needs to be through the roof, but also quality is not important at all. What do I mean by that? When people think what is quality content, they often think of production value. That is to say, the amount of money you have spent on your cameras, your lenses, your lighting, your microphone, all the different things. They think that quality content is determined by how much money you invest. And from this unique perspective, it's never mattered less than ever before. What actually matters is the quality of what you're actually creating, the quality of how you're serving your audience, what is the message that you're sharing, and how do you share it, the quality of how you're able to serve your audience and meet them where they're at and be able to bring them on a journey. That's actually the quality that you want to measure. That's actually the quality that actually has to be through the roof. But when it comes to all the other things, it's just fluff. How do I know this? Because literally with just a phone, you could just film yourself with one of those, AirPod, or what, not AirPods, but the wired earbuds, holding the microphone up to your mouth, and you could literally reach hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people every time that you do that. You don't actually need a budget. You don't need all the fancy gear. You have a supercomputer, a computer that has more computing power than the computer that put the man on the moon. That's how much power you have in your pocket. You have a broadcasting studio in your pocket that can literally reach around the world. This is the kind of thing that people have invested quite literally millions of dollars just a few decades ago to having the capacity to do. To be able to film something, to be able to broadcast it, would require millions of dollars of investment. And now, near every single one of the people, well, I'll just say this, every single person who's listening to this podcast has that. Even if it's a year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, you have it. And it's good enough. I have friends who have built multiple 100,000 subscriber followings on YouTube using just a phone. I have some friends that have built hundreds of thousands of followers on TikTok using just a phone. Same thing on Instagram, every other platform. In fact, what we teach in the Digital Missionary Academy, a strong percentage of the content that you would create through the formulas that we teach can literally be done on a phone. You don't even need to own a computer and you'd still be okay. So in this respect, I understand the money objection, but I think that a lot of the objections that come as to why I should not start, I would really strongly encourage people to do a serious analysis of that objection. I would imagine that 99%, could I imagine a world where this isn't true? Sure. But 99% of the people who have an objection as to why they shouldn't start, it's just rooted in some level of fear or insecurity or anxiety or doubt. And what I would encourage you to do is rather than focus on the objections, I would encourage you to focus on the all-sufficiency of the indwelling Spirit of God. The scriptures actually reveal that the same power that rose Jesus from the dead lives in you. And so if this power can animate the inanimate, can create order from chaos, surely he can teach you how to create your first video, to upload your first TikTok or your first reel or whatever the case is. I think we need to have far less confidence in what we can do and far more confidence in what God is going to do through us.
That's beautiful. And that was kind of what you kind of hit on that a little bit, but just maybe people's insecurity in the sense, well, I'm not a pastor. I didn't go to school. What do I can't, tell anyone about God. I haven't been quote unquote trained to do that. So what about the objections in terms of just feeling inadequate in terms of, having the content to begin with? They have the desire, but maybe they just feel like I'm not eloquent enough.
Yeah, let's remember the kinds of people that Jesus first called. Very likely young people who couldn't read, who were rejected by, the elite, the spiritual elite of their day. They were not rabbis. They were not teachers. They were, in many instances, uneducated, kind of peasant type people. Working class, at best, kind of a thing. Jesus doesn't need you to have a degree in order for him to use you. And so I get it. I get why you would want to be intentional about saying something of value, but this is also, again, this is the role of the Holy Spirit. Take no thought for tomorrow, for I will give you the words to speak, right? This idea of what does it actually look like to rely on the Holy Spirit? What does it actually look like to be connected to him so intimately that you just serve from the overflow? That as you spend time in that quiet place every morning, learning from the Holy Spirit, studying the scriptures, that whatever he's teaching you, you share from the overflow.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And then, there's another group of people out there, and I would classify them as church leaders. They could be pastors, for instance. They could be elders, board members, even, higher levels, at least in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the church that we're part of. There's several levels that go above the local church. There's the conference, there's the union, there's the division. Why should church leaders care about digital missions? What is the why for the larger leadership group of the church? When it comes to that group, sometimes they're thinking bottom line, right? So how does digital missions, get more people into our local church? When you're reaching people all around the world potentially. So what do you say to that? And I guess that's getting into the objections. So maybe start with the why. Why should church leaders be promoting digital missions on a broader sense?
Yeah, so there's many ways to kind of approach this objection. On one level, there's a lot of ministry that we do that doesn't have a measurable return on investment in butts and seats. We do a lot of homeless ministry. We do disaster relief. We have, food banks. We have a number of different services that we do that really don't need to be translated into increased butts and seats. Why? Because Jesus said we should do it. And for most of us, that's enough. Just simple obedience to the call and the challenge of what Jesus said is enough. And so first off, I would simply say this falls in that category. If that's all the answer was that Jesus said we should preach the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, and I don't know how else you plan on doing that, you should just do it. I would invite leaders to consider things like their travel budget and some of the other things that they have that are very normal expenses. I'm not even I'm not even saying that they're bad. They're necessary things. But when you think about the potential trade-off of what one administration person has at their fingertips for a travel budget in a given year, when you realize that if you just invested that money alone into digital missions, you could literally reach multiple millions of people with the gospel instead, it should at least give us pause to think about how we're using our resources as a denomination. I'll give you an example. In the Pacific Northwest, where I used to live, they had a kind of legacy magazine that has been sent out to their constituents for many, 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 many years. They were honest enough to say, you know what, we're spending serious amounts of money every single year on printing this magazine. And while it's doing a great thing, asking the honest question of, is this the most economical way to get this kind of information out, given the world that we live in today. They made the amazing decision to trim down the total number of issues that they printed, not just delete them entirely, but they reduced the number of issues that they would print by, I think, 50%. And with the savings that they had from reducing it from however many issues per year down to 50%, they had an increase, or they had a surplus budget now that they then decided to invest into online ministry, to digital conversations, to digital media and evangelism, if you will. They have now been able to reach so many more people with the existing budget that they had. So one way to look at it is, okay, Jesus told us to do it. So that's important. So how do we do it without even requiring an extra dollar to be spent? I would imagine that somewhere in most budgets out there, there's a little bit of room for trimming fat and a little bit of room for better stewardship in those areas so that we can continue to fulfill the Great Commission. The other way to approach it is this. It actually can affect how many people show up to your church. Maybe it won't be tomorrow. Maybe it will be. There are actually strategies to do that. But let's just talk about if it weren't tomorrow. I was at a conference for the Southern Union speaking on digital evangelism, presenting on these things. A pastor came up to me afterwards, Pastor Luke Steen. Shout out to Pastor Luke if you're listening to this. Luke said, "Hey, I just want to thank you so much for your YouTube ministry, Justin." I said, "Well, great. I'm glad to hear. It's been a blessing." He said, "In the last couple of years, I've had three young people from off the streets come up to me during a Sabbath service and tell them that the reason why that they're in this church is because they watched one of Justin Khoe's YouTube videos. They found out that I was a Seventh-day Adventist. They Googled the local Seventh-day Adventist church and decided to show up. All three of them are members of that church and are actually still attending that church today." I didn't even know that story. And I'll just tell you, if that's happened once in one church times three people, how many other times has it happened that we're just unaware of? So I want to say this, that we cast seed. Jesus talks about the sower who casts seed across many different soils. Obviously, out of 1 million people reach online, not all of them are going to respond, but a percentage of them will. This is just what Jesus tells us is the reality of what's going to happen. But we may not always know what's going to happen. But we don't stop this when it comes to any other type of ministry. We do this with radio ministry. We do this with television ministry. We do this with literature evangelism. When I would sell a book at a house, I would not know the fruit of that until many, many years later. You operate by faith, trusting because God told you to do it. He's also going to be faithful on his side of things, that when the word is preached, it never returns void. That's what he says. So we take it at face value. We sell all these books. We blanket an entire city with steps to Christ or whatever the case is. We spend tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, on these traditional means of evangelism. Why? Because we believe it's going to impact people's lives. And sure enough, it does. The number of times that I've heard stories of, my great-grandfather was in this little town in the middle of nowhere and a coal porter came and gave him a great controversy. And because of that one book, my grandfather and two of his friends started the local Seventh-day Adventist church. And now we're here 100 years later. There's hundreds of people that are a member of this church because of one book. So just because we can't measure it doesn't mean that it's not happening. That's the second layer. One is, even if it doesn't, it's still worth doing it. Number two, but there is an impact, and even if we can't measure it, we should have faith to know that it is happening. The third layer, I would say, is this. You can actually measure this now, because you send handbills and you spend $30,000 in mailing flyers for your local evangelistic series. And let's just be real. What's the result? Maybe a dozen people show up to your evangelistic series. Maybe. Now, with modern approaches to marketing, here's just what the data is. If you are following the proper steps, if you're following the proper strategies that are optimized for today, for an average of $20 to $40, I can have someone show up to your church this weekend. That's just what it is. There are strategies on actually getting butts in seats using social media marketing that will actually transform your attendance on a given weekend. I'll give you an example. When I was in the Northwest and I was living in Portland, we did this at my local church. We would do evangelistic seminars every single year, 2 times a year. And I was in this local church for a while, and I got to attend personally 2 of them, where we just did the standard, hand out a bunch of flyers to your church members. You pass them out to 5 neighbors over here, 5 neighbors over there. You call a few people. You just do the standard thing, right? We would have a nightly attendance somewhere in the realm of 75 people. And cool, God be praised, still worth it. 75 people is 75 people, praise the Lord. Well, the next year, was like, you know what? We should probably do some digital strategies. And thankfully enough, the church was willing to try it. We were willing to experiment with it. And long story short, we did a series of digital advertising and follow-ups approaches and engagement approaches, even while the meetings were happening, this whole well-rounded strategy. The result was we started the week of prayer with like 200 people in the building. We ended the week of prayer, I think it was somewhere in the realm of like 250 to 300 people. Like literally we were having elders setting up chairs in the foyer under their breath, air quotes, complaining about how many people were here and hoping that the fire marshal wouldn't show up because then they would shut us down. And all of that happened for a budget of just a few $1,000s. And so there is a way to get butts in seats. You just have to be willing to actually experiment and try. And even if it doesn't work the first time, you need to be able to stay the course. How many times have we invested money in evangelistic series that resulted in no baptisms? We've done it a lot. We don't like to talk about it, but we have done it all the time. And so if this is even a possibility, even if it's remotely possible that this is true, we should absolutely be exploring it because more people can be reached with less money. And strictly from a financial perspective, like let's imagine it costs you $10,000 to get, 10, 15, 20, 30 baptisms. Cool. Is that worth it? Think about the potential ROI if they are then discipled in the realm of stewardship. If their families start to send their kids to the schools, if they start to do all the different things that, good church members do, this is theoretically a net win from a financial perspective. And it happens to be people who are added to the kingdom. It's just a win. And so multiple ways that we can look at it. And I think all of them are sufficient to stand on their own legs. But the fact that all three of them work in tangent together, to me, again, it's just one of those things like, unless you're ignorant of what it can do, there's really no excuse. If you know that this is a possibility, we need to be having those conversations of how, not if, not should, but how. How do we do this in our next thing? And what does it look like to actually move forward intentionally and strategically for the kingdom of God?
Yeah, and I can attest that from my own experience with my digital ministry. I mean, yes, like you said, you're reaching people all over the world in one sense, but every time I did my analytics, it always was like Daytona Beach was like the center, and it was like out from there. So it emanates from where you're at, and so I agree. Like if churches took this on as a strategy, of course, yes, you're going to be, reaching people outside of your particular area, but the majority of the people you're going to reach are going to be people that you interact with or people that you come in contact with and somehow find out that you have a digital ministry and they start listening and they start sharing it with their friends and then it's, word of mouth, like you said, and it grows. And so, we saw that impact in Daytona with baptisms that, literal local baptisms as a result of our digital outreach. And that was, one of the things that I was really surprised about. And when we made our film, Adventology Story, a few years ago, that was one of the things we highlighted was one of the young men that came in and we baptized, from just sharing the gospel online. And then, like you said, that's just one story.
Yeah, and for every one of those stories, there's got to be 100 others that you're just not aware of.
Exactly.
I just heard the story today from a pastor that we've worked with in the past. Shout out to Pastor Juan Rodriguez over in the Florida conference. He was doing a series in one of the smaller churches in his territory, and for a budget of $500, I think the numbers are something like they have an average attendance of like 60 people. They baptized 12 people using social media as the advertising mechanism for this event. It just makes sense. It just works. Now, maybe not every result will be so economically advantageous. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit more expensive. Sometimes it'll be less. We don't know. But we do know that it is better than the way we have done things. That, to me, is abundantly clear.
And I think that's kind of like where the issue is. It's a new paradigm, right? And people have invested a lot of time and energy and their career to some degree in the old paradigm. And it's hard kind of to emotionally detach from that to some degree because that paradigm. And a lot of church leaders, unfortunately, haven't tried it yet. So they're a little intimidated, just like the church members, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to that, I understand. It is a scary world, absolutely. And I'm very sympathetic to that because when I have to start a new platform or when I'm shifting my strategies, it is a very scary thing, even for me. So I can only imagine for those who have been doing it the way that they've always been doing it for decades, how much more terrifying it is. And yet, in the middle of that, I would just invite you to look around your local church and just do an honest inventory, an honest audit of the state of your church. Are things working? Yes or no? Will you have a reasonable chance of success doing things the way that you have done it? Because in most churches, I would imagine, because I've traveled quite a bit, here in the division and beyond. I've been to quite a lot of churches, and it seems as though that one of the kind of common denominators is things aren't always the way that they were before. Especially post-COVID, a lot of churches are struggling. Some churches are actually thriving. The post-COVID shift has been very good for some churches, but it seems like those are a minority. It seems like the majority of churches are struggling to get back on their 2 feet. And so I just don't know. Like if when you do an inventory of your church, if you see, man, everything's working great and we're growing, fantastic. Don't do anything different. Just keep staying the road because that just makes sense. What's working is working. Keep doing it. But if you feel as though there could be more, if you feel like there's a gap between what you're seeing and what you believe the Lord is wanting for your local congregation, I think it requires leadership to have a level of faith, to say, you know what, we need to actually dream dreams. We need to have visions of what it could be. And what does it look like to pursue that by faith? That's the paradigm. I get the fear, I get the anxiety, I get the challenge of shifting away from what we've always done. But faith is diametrically opposed to all of that. And I would encourage us in the middle of our anxiety to be people of faith.
I love that. It's inspiring me, even though I'm like sold out, and I'm like, that's the power of the vision, right? It's the power of faith. It's like you just keep talking about it and it revives in your own heart. So I know in your Digital Missions Academy, which I highly recommend anybody who's serious about this to and we'll have some information about how you can connect with that at the end and in the show notes today. What are some basic components for effective digital mission strategy? I mean, you can maybe start with just an individual. When you think about strategy, sometimes people get intimidated by that word. Mm-hmm. So, mm-hmm. Just maybe in like 3 steps or, 4 steps. I'm not sure what the number would be. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but just for an individual, like, a strategy would be kind of like a plan, right?
Sure.
And then with an objective, and then you have a reasoned process for why you're doing what you're doing with a desired outcome at the end. So just what, for like an individual, for instance, what would be like a strategy for them to potentially be successful?
Well, the strategies, whether you're an individual, your church, your evangelist, your conference, are all fairly the same.
Okay.
At the very beginning, one of the first fundamental problems that you're going to need is that of exposure. How do you get your message in front of people that don't already know about your message? In the local church context, that looks like, how do I actually get my message outside of the 4 walls? I have my 100, 200 in this church, 400 is what you said. That's fantastic. But I have my couple hundred people that I speak to every single week. That's great, and I want to keep doing that. But how do I get that message in a way that will be received in front of other people? It's a problem of exposure. How do I reach the next person? And so good social media strategy has an awareness of what the tools are optimized for. What tools are best for that exposure element, and what tools are best for people who are already kind of in the club, as it were. I'll give you an example. Most churches, when they think of their digital strategy, the first thing that they think about, and it's a good thing to think about, is live streaming. Mm-hmm. But let's be honest about this. When was the last time you ever watched someone else's live stream? Very likely not the case, unless it's just like you're doing like the Sabbath marathon. You're just watching every single church that's going out there. But the vast majority of people, they're not interested in watching live streams. The people that a live stream serves are the people who are already part of the club. They are members of your church who are traveling. They're members of your church who might be sick. They're members of your church who might be even a little bit lazy on a given weekend. Maybe the kids are going crazy or whatever the case is. But all things being equal, live streams serve your existing audience. Live streams, therefore, are not actually a good tool for exposure. They're not a good tool for reaching new people. So if a church cares about adding to that bottom line to be able to see people in the building, they have to realize they're going to need to leverage more tools than just a live stream. And so as it turns out, right now, the kind of meta, as it were, the strategy, general practices for exposure include using a lot of short form content. That's like vertical videos that are under 60 seconds, oftentimes even under 30 seconds. Sometimes on Instagram, that's like carousels or photos, things like that. How do you use short form content in a way to serve people's needs at scale? So that way, rather than just doing something once a week, like a live stream, you're able to do something every single day, if not multiple times a day. So on my social media ministry, for example, I prioritize hitting upload minimum twice a day. There's a reality where I could even think about scaling it up. So what does it look like for a church to empower a handful of individuals, half a dozen, maybe even more people in their local context to serve through their own personality? That is, to use their own agency, to borrow the language of David and Goliath, to fight in their own armor and to be able to share from the overflow what God is teaching them in their own skin to their own individual networks. And what does it look like from your church empowering them to successfully do this? Not just once a week, sharing the live stream, but actually sharing their message of encouragement every single day, multiple times a day. What happens is the church's potential reach expands literally exponentially. When you empower more than one person than let me say it this way. When you empower more than just the pastor to be the bearer of good news, you will literally, every time you add another person, multiply your church's impact. And the unfortunate thing is right now, most churches are only organized that one person is the messenger. And so we need to think about how does it look like to actually equip members in my church community to be digital missionaries or missionaries in some other general sense. But as we do that successfully, now our impact is multiplied. And every time that we learn a new strategy from one member and that member teaches the other members and we actually kind of learn in community, our total impact increases over and over and over and over. So the first step that we need to think about is, what does increasing exposure look like? I would suggest, if you are a church empowering a handful of individuals who have this aptitude for this kind of a thing, to actually disciple them, to train them in the world of digital missions so that God can work through them specifically.
So what I hear you saying is, not only should the church kind of slice up maybe whatever the speaker was for that week into bite-sized chunks and push those out as content that goes out through the week as in short form video, which in and of itself is going to dramatically increase the impact of the weekly message to reach more people and then grow the audience of the actual church service. Beyond that, what I hear you saying is training more voices beyond just that of the pastor or the weekly speaker during the 11 o'clock hour of worship, so that you're exponentially increasing the messengers as well as the message, and doing those things together, at least from a local church strategy, will have a dramatic impact.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I mean, it's something that inspired me, because that's something that, I'm growing in as a church pastor. Even like I said, I'm totally sold out on this concept. There's still a lot of growth and learning that is required. It's not going to just happen all at once, is it?
No, definitely not. And for that perspective, I'm learning every single day too. There are still times where I'm like, oh, this is going to work. It's going to be a fantastic thing. I'm sure you felt this before. Like, man, this video is going to be the one that pops. And then crickets, like nothing happens. And then you get humbled a little bit, and then you learn from that mistake or whatever the case is. Yeah, it's all a learning journey. There's no bar of perfection that you need to reach before God uses you. God will work through a donkey. God is going to work through the rocks if you don't actually participate. And so the question isn't really like if we're going to, or the question isn't really like, can God work through us? It's just that if we choose to say yes. And so that's the challenge, is just step up to the plate, answer the call from the Holy Spirit, say yes, put yourself out there. And what does it actually look like to prioritize that in the rhythms of your life such that you do this every single day? And the reality is that once you go through that learning process, the learning process is challenging. That's the reality of it. There's some new skills. This is the sense in which it's missions. You're learning new cultures. You're learning new social norms. You have to develop new skill sets. All these things are true. But at some point, once you start to develop a certain level of competency, it doesn't actually require that much time. For my 2 pieces of content that I do every single day, total time invested in my daily process is under half an hour. So there's a very real sense in which when you learn the skills, you can do this at scale. And there are other ways that you could do it even more kind of strategically. For example, I do a Bible study every single Sunday morning, and I lead that. I've started just experimenting in the last 2 weeks. This is a brand new experiment. I haven't even told anyone in the Digital Missionary Academy, Travis, that I'm trying this because I want to see what happens. But I'm now starting to cut up my Bible study content like you would for your sermon and cutting it to 30-second bits for micro content. And now the result is for the Bible study that I'm already presenting, if I add an extra hour in slicing it up, like in the last Bible study, I created 12 pieces of content in 1 hour. So I could theoretically have my entire week's content done in 1 hour. So there is a way to do this more efficiently. We just have to think about it. We actually have to experiment. We have to try. And so if it's okay, my first carousel, you know this part, but my first carousel took me like 4, 5, 6 hours. It was a lot of work. But then as you learn, you get better. No one who's an adult now, hopefully not, you hop on a bike, you don't think because you've just done it. It becomes second nature. There's a very real sense in which these skills that are needed to do digital missions can become second nature.
Yeah, and I think, just to add on to, just the concept of digital missions, obviously it implies that we're reaching people not in our faith community. And whether that's locally or, around the world. But I think digital missions connects and becomes digital discipleship for
Absolutely.
the community, right? So not only are these pieces of content potentially reaching new people, but just like I just mentioned to you, just this conversation reinforces in my own heart, my own convictions, which is kind of what discipleship really is. I mean, you think about the disciples, they spent 3.5 years following Jesus, and they were with him, pretty much every day, right? And that's almost impossible in our world, in the analog world, but not necessarily in the digital world, right? You could literally be with somebody every day, encouraging somebody who's already a believer.
That's absolutely right.
Doing the same method, right?
Yeah. So I exist within a network of other people in the same ministry. So, there's a certain respect in which I do my own thing, for sure. I create my own content, but there is a process of follow-up and discipleship. So at the first level, you want to think about exposure. At the second level, you want to think about nurturing. So cool, they know about you already. They may even start following you, but you want to hopefully lead them to next steps. You want to be able to help them progress and to grow and journey in a deeper sense. So right now in my ministry team, I run one Bible study per week. That's an offering to my followers, and people take that up. My average Bible study attendance is probably 80 people every Sunday morning, but I'm only one of 10 Bible studies that happen every single week that are all digital. We're currently in the process of attempting to scale this up to the extent where we have 3 Bible studies every single day at various time zones so that people from literally all over the world can have a Bible study small group that is convenient for their time zone. And so we want to think first about exposure, because otherwise, who are we discipling? Who are we nurturing? Nobody, if we don't have anybody new, right? So first is that level of exposure. But secondly is thinking about, well, what do those next steps look like? How do we actually nurture someone and encourage them? And this is what's fantastic about social media ministry. This is what, in many ways, makes social media ministry superior, not equal, but superior to in-person ministry. And that's a bold claim, because most people think like, oh, social media is good, but in-person ministry is the holy grail. It's like, yes, it's good in many ways, and there are many ways in which in-person ministry is better than social, but this is one of the ways that social is better. You can disciple someone literally every single day. Mind-blowing. Like I was doing this podcast called The Move, where we would do journeys through entire books of the Bible. So we've done 4 seasons now, something like 300 plus episodes, 20-minute episodes doing deep dive, verse by verse, kind of conversation/commentary on entire books of the Bible. We've done Genesis, we've done Romans, we've done Hebrews and John at this point. I have not uploaded a new thing on that podcast for well over a year, or maybe not well over, maybe about 6 months to a year, because life has been busy. I've been focusing on building the Digital Missionary Academy, and I had a kid and all the things, right? I just looked at the metrics this last week. In the last week, 500 people have been consuming that podcast, even though I haven't touched it. So we're talking about 50,000 people cumulatively who've been journeying through this deep dive nurturing experience. Some people who have actually messaged me saying, Justin, when's the next season coming out? Because I've listened to every single one of those episodes. Someone actually wrote me saying, Justin, I want to thank you so much for The Move, because even though I've been attending the Seventh-day Adventist church for over 20 years, he says, I feel like in this one season, I've learned more than I have in those 20 years in my local church. I'm just flabbergasted because, well, actually, it's not terribly surprising because if he was like me growing up, I was sleeping through most church services. It was just a struggle. I was one of those kids. I was one of the problem kids. Maybe he was one of those. I don't know. But the point being is that every day this guy's tuning in, getting to spend more time in reflection on the word and just contemplating what does it actually look like to move according to this word that's offered to him, and what does it look like to actually incorporate the life of faith into his everyday, like it's daily discipleship at scale. And now that I'm doing this thing with short form content, I have people I've been journeying with for literally years. And it is just a fascinating thing to think about, man, people are actually journeying with, they're actually learning, they're growing, they're transforming because of what we're putting out on a device like a phone. So I was talking to a pastor, and I won't name him, but he'll probably listen to this interview, and shout out to you because you know who you are. But he was thinking about doing some honest self-reflection about his typical service. Because if he was going to chop up his own sermon, how many strong 1-minute bits could he get out of his sermon? And he was just being honest. He's like, man, a lot of what we say on the stage is just kind of fluff. Like it's just a lot of filler stuff because, you have all that extra space. You're not really just saying meaningful. He's like, I could probably get maybe half a dozen clips out of a 30-minute sermon. It was an honest reflection. So in a certain way, you're actually able to give more substantive content to people if you were to do something every day than even if they were to attend church every single week. And this is the wild thing. Regular church attendance, the definition of regular church attendance has shifted. It used to be that regular church attendance was something like 3 times a week. It's now 1 or 2. Most people, in their relationship to church, and I don't know, maybe it's different in wherever the listener is, but most people maybe go to church once a month, maybe twice a month. There's a whole vast majority of people who literally only go to church on like Easter and Christmas. That's a real thing. That's not just a joke. But to think that you could actually be in their feed, in their consciousness every single day, and imagine if multiple people in your church community were doing this. So now, rather than just having a message from the Lord once a year, once a month, maybe just once a week at best, now they're getting 3, 4, 5, 10 messages every single day. How much better could that be for spiritual formation? Now, obviously, we still want to get them to that last section. So we're talking about exposure. We're talking about nurture. But now we actually want to do community. That's that third layer. But community is often an overflow of successful nurturing.
Yeah, before you get into that third layer, which I'm really interested in hearing, I just want to affirm what you just said about just that evergreen content.
Mm-hmm.
That things that you produced years ago, people still come up to me and tell me, oh yeah, I'm listening to your podcast, and I'm like, I haven't put an episode out in a while,
Sure.
and it's kind of almost like makes me bashful in a way because that's like, man, I need to get back in it, and I am currently rebooting everything, but it is such an intimate experience, right? I mean, when somebody puts their earbuds on, your voice is literally in their ear, and they're walking around, and it's like you're there, and you're talking straight into their. It's a very intimate experience.
Very much so. Yeah.
Because in a sermon, I'm not saying like you said, there's something powerful about being in a large gathering, and you see the movement of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes there's more of a feeling of solidarity. I love corporate worship. I wouldn't ever give that up. But there's also something powerful about just being alone, walking and being out in nature and listening to a podcast, right? And just learning and being brought closer to God through someone else's voice. And I think that there's the potential for discipleship through digital is like you were just saying. I just totally agree that it's so much greater than what we can accomplish in the analog world. But yeah, so let's go to that third level now. You talked about, so you want to reach people. That's the first goal. You got to find people.
Mm-hmm.
The second is once you found them and they start following you, you want to nurture them.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the last one.
The last one is the one that we all want. And let's be real, that's something that we all want. It's not something that I'm opposed to because I'm all about the digital world and because oftentimes people hear my emphasis on digital missions and they feel threatened in the physical world. They say, oh no, but if we do successful online missions, then they won't show up in my church. And I get why that's an initial gut response. But let's just think about the logic for that. If I was a touring band and I was attempting to sell out a stadium, who would attend my communal event? Who would attend my in-person experience? If not the people who have purchased my digital music and have been listening to my music day after day after day after day. What I believe firmly is this, is that successful nurturing in the online space actually leads to community, not subtracts away from it. The kinds of people who want to show up in person are the ones who feel a sense of camaraderie in all the other spaces of their life. I'll give you an example. Just 2 days ago, I was in Los Angeles, and I've been doing these Bible studies for the last 2 years or so. I finally, for the first time, had the opportunity to meet someone in person who's been attending my Bible study for the last little while now. Someone who I've been journeying with and nurturing and discipling through the digital space, just through avatars and Zoom meetings and DMs and text messages. I actually got to sit at her house with some friends and actually spend hours breaking down the word together and just journey with her. We were in community. Why? Because we have actually spent time, hours upon hours upon hours, interacting in the digital world. Successful digital nurturing actually leads to community. When we take my ministry on the road and the ministry that I'm a part of, we see people showing up all the time simply because there's a connection in the digital world. And so what's beautiful about this is that there's many ways to accomplish community. The simple fact of it is that 99.9% of the people who interact with your audience, if you have any sizable audience, they very likely won't interact with you in person in your physical church because they literally live somewhere else. That's not bad. Let's just count it up as a win because we're actually reaching people and nurturing people in their own individual way. That's still a win. But beyond that, you can actually still see the communities develop in their own way. Because our ministry is able to reach a larger audience of people, what we're starting to see now is actually communities popping up on their own. So for example, people that I've never met, in person, that is. We have word of a women's retreat taking place because there's a handful of people who started hanging out in the online experience, the internet church experience, which maybe we could talk about, I don't know. But we run an online church program every other week called Internet Church. And one of the things that happens is people get to meet each other. And what started to organically develop was people started to realize, oh, I live in Ohio. You live in Ohio. Hey, she lives in Ohio. And so 20 odd people started meeting together in person doing Bible studies because they connected in the online space. I have a friend of mine, a childhood friend, who's getting married to somebody that he met through a video game in the online world. We're seeing this happen all the time. The majority of people who are getting married that are young people today, that are meeting their spouse, are meeting them through apps on a phone. The world of the physical reality and the digital space have overlapped and become one in many people's lived experience. Now, I understand for people who are maybe above a certain age, that might be foreign to you, but a lot of us, and I say us like I'm still young. I'm past my 30s. I'm officially the age when I was a child thinking of my father as man, he turned 33 or he turned 32. He's old. I'm old now. I'm old in my own estimation as a child. But young people today, what I'm trying to say is, that was a detour. What I'm trying to say is this, is that young people today don't see a division between the real world and the digital world. It is the same world. It's just one and the same. And so what we're seeing now is that community is popping up. There are digital spaces where people are meeting and connecting. There are also physical spaces that are meeting and connecting. And now we actually have the opportunity to take our ministry on the road and actually create pop-up events where people are able to meet together physically, oftentimes for the first time if they wanted to. So a lot of room for community as well.
Yeah, I mean, it truly is just the beginning of a revolution. It's like this huge paradigm shift that our generation is living through, one of the fastest and most intense shifts that this world has ever seen. And so, yeah, there is a lot of negative that comes with that. And I understand, like you said, that some people can focus on the negative side of the changes that are happening in the world. But as Christians, what I hear you saying is, hey, let's focus on what this could do for us and the kingdom. And so kind of I know we've been talking for a while, so maybe, there's plenty of other questions I could ask you, but just for the sake of time, we've been talking about digital missions. I'm just curious, what is your digital dream? Everybody has kind of, and I know this changes, we update our dream, but just currently, for you right now? When you look 5 years into the future, for instance, what is like, if you were just painting this picture of like what ideally you'd love to see for the church, your digital dream for the church, what would you like to see happening in our church?
Yeah, that's actually a rather tough question for me to answer. Which is funny because on my podcast, I usually end up asking a version of this question. What do you anticipate for the future of the church or something along those lines? And the reality is, I don't know. Things change so much that I have very little clue or very little confidence, at least, with what's going to happen in the future. And in the last couple of years, I have felt more and more impressed to not make specific dreams anymore, and instead to just simply move by obedience to what I believe God is calling me to do next. I've actually, in many ways, relinquished the need to know what's coming up. It's very counterintuitive. It's very different. I'm not saying that you need to do this. I'm just saying that this is how I've chosen to live the last couple of years of my life. I don't know what's coming up next. Like, I literally don't know what I would do next year. I wouldn't even know 6 months from now. Like, there's a very real sense in which I take life almost week by week by week, just figuring things out in that respect. And to me, it's simplified in this way. I orient my life around trying to figure out how can I, at least when it comes to the mission and vocation side of things. Obviously, there's the family and there's other things. But I think about just simply, how can I actually spread the gospel to as many people as possible? It's really that simple. That's how I want to spend the majority of my time. And if digital is the way to do it, fantastic. If there's a new way to do it, fantastic. I just want to do that. And the second, I guess, major assignment, that's probably the better language for it. The second assignment that I really feel called to is equipping and training other people to do so. There's a very real sense in which I understand how limited my reach is. Even if like through the storytelling, you might be feeling like, oh man, this guy's, reaching all these kinds of people. It's like, I'm just one dude. Like, there's only so much that I can do. And there's a very real sense in which not a lot of people like my presentation style. They don't like my personality. They might not even like my face. I don't know what it is. I'm only suited to reach so many people. And so it's just simple. If I really do care about that first thing, about just spreading the gospel to people, then I just need to realize I'm not doing this alone. I want to inspire hundreds, if not thousands, of people to take up this mantle, this vision of using their own voice, so God can communicate through them. And so that for me is like why I do the Digital Missionary Academy, is because it's just another way to do the first thing. It's if I can empower other people to do it as well, then God be praised, because the promise is that when Jesus is lifted high, he draws all people to him. And so that's just really what I focus about. As far as what the future looks like, I really don't know. I want to believe in a world where the online and the in-person become more merged, because I just think that that's going to be healthy. A world where discipleship is not something that only happens week to week to week, just on the weekends alone, but discipleship is something that happens every single day of your life, because there's so many opportunities to plug in, to connect. I want to believe in a world where community is deepened and empowered through online media, and even where it actually transforms the landscape of what church could look like. What would it look like if church was not a place that was optimized around teaching, but optimized around community? Imagine how much better Sabbath could be when we didn't have to do all the pomp and circumstance of the standard church service because of tradition. What if 6 days out of the week we were gathering manna such that the seventh no one had to work? And instead we could just gather in nature and in community in our homes and just spend time with people. And there was no need for the pomp and circumstance, because we've all been fed, we've all been studying, we've all been serving throughout the week, and we could actually just rest with community. I want to believe that if we do this, the net win is more people are reached and community gets deepened, because we can actually focus on community, where church is no longer about content. Church is about people, because social media seems to be more optimized for the content and the teaching side. So those are just, those are some of the musings that I have. Am I married to any one of these things? No, not necessarily. I'm just trying to be obedient, trying to move by faith. That's just the simple way I try to live my life.
I love it. So you mentioned, and we've talked about this, throughout the interview today. A lot of your energy right now has been over the last year almost on the Digital Mission Academy. I'm a graduate. If somebody wants to connect to that, why would someone sign up for the Digital Mission Academy, and how can they do it? And just maybe a little Yeah, just a little commercial about what you're doing and what they would get if they
Sure.
signed up.
So the Digital Missionary Academy emerged from a problem. And the problem was this. I would go to conferences, I would go to youth camps, I would do events like the one that we're gathered here in person to do, where I would train people on social media ministry. And generally speaking, all things being equal, the result was the same. People were very inspired, they were challenged by the stories, they might even be motivated in some way, shape, or form, like to get started. Like maybe someone who's listening right now is like, oh my goodness, I could never thought about it this way. Like I do want to do that. Like that sounds like a lot of fun. Inevitably, I found problems would emerge. They would start creating content. They would try doing one or two things, and maybe the things even worked, but at some point, they reach a wall, and then they get stuck, and they don't know what to do next. And the lack of mentorship and the lack of guidance became a real glaring issue. People wanted to do this, but they don't know how to do it. And the reality is, for most people, like it's just a tough thing to do. I get it. It is a difficult world to navigate, especially if you're not a digital native. If you grew up in a world where just you're a latchkey kid, or you're just, you were just out and about in the streets riding your bike or playing, basketball with your friends until the lights came on, kind of a thing. Like to try and navigate the online world is really, really tough. And so the Digital Missionary Academy emerged out of a realization that there's only so much that I could do even if I have a full weekend. Even if I had a full week to teach and to give you all the information, at some point, all of that falls short if you don't have ongoing coaching and mentorship and someone who can pray with you and community that you can engage with. So the Digital Missionary Academy is exactly that. It's my attempt to be able to share everything that I've ever learned in the world of digital missions, to give above and beyond of myself, my stories, my perspective. It's also a way for me to provide community so that other digital missionaries don't have to feel alone like I did when I first started. And it's a way for them to continue growing and learning together. That way, when you learn something, Travis, you can share it with me and we can share it with each other, and we all end up with this kind of cumulative net increase. And so the Digital Missionary Academy is this. It's an online program that can be accessed from any part in the world. There's an on-demand element to it where you can access something like over 100 hours of training right now. If this last, hour or so has been valuable to you, times it by 100. That's what's available in the Digital Missionary Academy. In addition to that, there are live classes that happen every single week, anywhere between 4 to 6 hours of live teaching, interactive teaching with me online. And so that way, anytime you have questions, you can literally ask me the question and I'll be able to help facilitate what does it look like solving the issue that you're working through, give you a bit of a nudge in the right direction, some guidance. And there's a huge community building element to that where you can collaborate with other content creators. You can learn from them. We're collaborating because you and I met in this or at least we've nurtured our relationship because you and I connected in person actually first. But we've nurtured this. We've actually gone back and forth for many, many, many hours through this medium. And now we actually get to work together in this capacity. And so all that to say, it is the space that is curated for a pastor, for an evangelist, for a lay person like myself, or a church that's wanting to really take the idea of digital mission seriously. You're convinced this should be a thing, and I feel called to do it, but I don't know where to start. This is everything that I wish that I had when I first started. And my goal is to accelerate the pace in which you learn and you grow. And quite explicitly, the goal of the program is to help you reach your first 1 million people with the gospel and beyond. And the cool thing is we're starting to get stories back of students who have reached their first 1 million and more than that, 5 million, 10 million. We had one student who reached over 150 million people in the last 30 days. Blows my mind. I've never reached those numbers. And so in any way, shape, or form that I can empower someone else to just go beyond, praise the Lord, let's go. So this is the real thing. It's just if you feel serious that this is for you, then the Digital Missionary Academy is the best thing that I know how to provide. There are other courses that are out there on marketing and YouTube this and whatever the case is, but the reality is that those courses need to be translated. A lot of those courses focus on building a business, affiliate marketing, or doing things for services and products that really have nothing to do with the world of the church. And if you want to go that, fantastic. There's a bunch of programs that I have paid for myself, probably spent over 20 grand in training and education for myself in order for me to have some level of competency. But at the end of it all, I had to translate it for the world of the church. The Digital Missionary Academy is literally translated for those of us who care about one thing above all else. How do we preach the gospel in this world that we live in today? And when I think about the way that money could be spent on evangelism, on training, on all these things, I just invite people to think about the way we used to do things. Think about the old ways where you invite a speaker in and they would require $30,000 of mailers being spent to just blanket an entire city. And at the end result, God bless you, you probably had a dozen, two, maybe 3 dozen baptisms. Praise the Lord. Awesome. But the problem is that in order to have that same result next year, you have to spend that money again. And the traditional model of evangelism is a very expensive thing, but we value it because it actually reaches people with the gospel. What I would offer is this: learning the skills of digital missions enables you to build the kind of audience that you could be very excited about serving every single day. And the beautiful thing is that once you learn the skills to acquire that audience, you never have to spend it again. That is to say that that investment will pay dividends for the rest of your ministry. And so to join the Digital Missionary Academy, there's a lot of more that I can say, but for just to keep it brief, it's very simple. You can actually just send me an email, hello@justinkhoe.com. I was going to give the podcast plug. Actually, I'm going to end up, for those of you guys who are listening to this, you already know this. I'm going to upload this episode onto the Digital Missions Podcast as well. I haven't even asked you yet, Travis, but we're going to do that. So hello@digitalmissionspodcast.com. Send me an email, say that you want to join the academy. I'll hop on the phone with you and just walk you through some of the process, answer any questions that you have, let you know about the current offerings, and what does it take to actually sign up. So just send me an email, hello@digitalmissionspodcast, or if you prefer, my personal email, hello@justinkhoe.com.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really enjoyed, I mean, obviously the content was king, but you mentioned the cohort, right? So there's different cohorts that start, basically quarterly, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And so, if you miss one, you can always jump on the next one, right? And then once you're an alumni, you can still kind of stick your head in every once in a while and get a reboot and go back and remind yourself of something if you weren't quite ready in that stage of your ministry, because some of the things you teach, are for later on, right? Sometimes, and then you're like, oh, I'm ready to understand this part now, and you can go back and learn. So I definitely highly recommend it. I've, sponsored several of my church members here in Fort Myers through the program.
Amen.
I'm excited. I'm that this weekend, I'm sure there's going to be that offer again. And dude, it's been awesome, man. I love this face-to-face. I mean, I think this, in a nutshell, just in this little bit of time we've talked, I feel like, we really, you shared a great vision for digital missions, and I think provide a lot of clarity for people that maybe had questions. So thanks so much for being here, man. And it's so great to have you in Florida.
It is my privilege. So we want to make sure that we give proper thanks and praise to, not just to you, because you're hosting us, and of course, I'm very grateful for the interview. By the way, great job. Appreciate it. But also shout out to Juan, who at the moment is sleeping on the couch next to us because it's late at night and he's driven and he's a little bit sick, truth be told. But Juan, if you ever listen to this, I just want you to know that I love you and I appreciate the way that you've kicked doors down on my behalf, and you've been an encouragement and a support. None of this would be happening without your support and your love and your mentorship.
Dude, Juan, we love you, man. He's been my biggest supporter as well. I love working in Florida, and Juan, you're the best, man. So, hey, again, thanks for being here, Justin, and let's have a great digital missions weekend together.
Amen.
Amen.